The floorboards creaked overhead like broken bones as heavy boots paced back and forth. Emma pressed her back against the damp cellar wall, her arms wrapped around Lucy and Sarah, feeling their small bodies tremble against hers in the suffocating darkness. The smell of rotting vegetables and stale whiskey seeped through the wooden planks above, mixing with the stench of fear that clung to their unwashed clothes. Through the thin gaps between the boards, she could hear men's voices, rough and slurred, haggling over prices like they were discussing livestock. Because that's exactly what they were doing. Emma's stomach churned as she remembered Uncle Henry's words from 3 days ago, his tobacco-stained fingers pointing at them like they were nothing more than burdens to be disposed of. "You girls cost me too much to feed. Time you started earning. Your keep." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cellar door groaned open, sending a shaft of amber light cutting through the darkness. Tom Bradley's silhouette filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out most of the light from the saloon above. His leather vest strained against. His belly and his beard was matted with grease and crumbs. In his meaty hand, he clutched a bottle of whiskey that sloshed as he descended the rickety stairs. Well, he wheezed, his voice like gravel scraping against glass. "Time to make your uncle some money, little ladies." His bloodshot eyes swept over them, lingering too long on Emma's face. She instinctively pulled her sisters closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lucy whimpered softly, burying her face in Emma's shoulder, while 8-year-old Sarah clutched her tattered doll with white knuckles. Bradley grabbed Emma's wrist with fingers that felt like iron clamps. "You first, sweetheart." The gentlemen upstairs are mighty eager to see what they're bidding on. His breath reeked of alcohol and decay as he yanked her to her feet. Emma's legs nearly buckled after sitting cramped in the cellar for hours, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're just children. Let them go." Bradley's laugh was like broken glass. "Children fetch good prices in these parts. Lots of lonely men out here need help with cooking and cleaning." The way he said it made Emma's skin crawl. She knew exactly what kind of help these men really wanted. The stairs groaned under their weight as Bradley dragged Emma upward, her worn boots slipping on the warped wood. Behind them, Lucy's muffled sobs echoed in the cellar, each sound like a knife twisting in Emma's chest. She had promised her mother on her deathbed 2 years ago that she would protect her sisters, keep them safe from the world's cruelty. Now she was failing in the worst possible way. The golden saloon hit her senses like a physical blow. Cigar. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies, spilled beer, and something else she couldn't identify but made her stomach lurch. The main room buzzed with conversation and the clink of glasses, but as Bradley hauled her through the crowd, conversations died and heads turned. Emma kept her eyes fixed on the floor, but she could feel their stares crawling over her like insects. Men lined the walls, their faces flushed red from alcohol and something darker. Some wore the rough clothes of miners, dirt still caked under their fingernails. Others dressed like merchants, their fine coats doing nothing to hide the hunger in their eyes. A few wore the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers, though Emma doubted they were here on official business. "Gentlemen!" Bradley's voice boomed across the room as he shoved Emma onto a makeshift platform near the bar. "As promised, the finest selection this side of Denver. Young, healthy, and ready for hard work." The way he emphasized the last words made several men chuckle and elbow each other. Emma's hands shook as she stood on the platform, every eye in the room fixed on her. She was 16, tall for her age, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight despite being tangled and dirty. Her dress, once blue calico, was now faded and torn at the hem, but it couldn't hide the fact that she was no longer a child. That realization seemed to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Bradley announced, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "Do I hear 50? "60, called out a man near the back, his voice thick with whiskey. "75. Another voice joined in, this one from a bearded miner whose clothes reeked of sulfur. Emma closed her eyes, trying to block out the nightmare unfolding around her. In her mind, she could see her mother's face, pale and gaunt in those final days, making Emma promise to keep the family together. "You're the strong one," her mother had whispered. "Lucy and Sarah will need you to be brave for them." But how could she be brave now? How could she protect anyone when she couldn't even protect herself? $100! The voice belonged to a cavalry officer with lieutenant's stripes on his sleeve. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes held the same predatory gleam as the others. Emma's knees threatened to give out. $100 was more money than her family had seen in months. To these men, it was the price of owning a human being. $125. A new voice entered the fray, this one from a man, in an expensive suit, who looked like he might own a business in town. His smile revealed gold teeth that glinted in the lamplight. Bradley rubbed his hands together greedily. "Now we're talking, gentlemen. Do I hear 150? The bidding continued to escalate, each number hammering another nail into Emma's coffin. She thought about Lucy and Sarah waiting in the cellar below, probably clinging to each other and wondering when their turn would come. The thought made her stomach twist with rage and helplessness. Just as the gold-toothed man opened his mouth to bid again, the saloon doors exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire building. Every head turned toward the entrance as a figure stepped through the swirling dust and broken wood. The man was tall and lean, with shoulders that stretched his canvas shirt and hands that looked like they could break a man's neck without effort. His hat cast shadows across his face, but Emma could see steel gray eyes that swept the room with the intensity of a hunting wolf. The saloon fell dead silent except for the creak of the broken doors swaying on their hinges. Even Bradley's confident smirk faltered as the stranger's gaze fixed on him with unmistakable contempt. "Well, well," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Looks like I walked into the wrong kind of establishment." He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor like gunshots. "Though from what I can see, calling this an establishment might be giving it too much credit." Bradley puffed out his chest, trying to regain his composure. "This is a private gathering, stranger. You'd best move along before there's trouble." The man's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Trouble?" He tilted his hat back, revealing a face weathered by sun and hard work, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. "Friend, you haven't seen trouble yet." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma watched in fascination as this stranger faced down a room full of armed men without showing a trace of fear. There was something about him that reminded her of the wild stallions she'd seen on the plains, untamed and dangerous to anyone, foolish enough to try to break them. "Now," the stranger continued, his hand resting casually on the grip of the Colt revolver at his hip, "I'm going to ask real polite-like for you to let that girl down from there and go about your business. Somewhere else." Ush, Bradley's face turned purple with indignation. "You can't just walk in here and start making demands. This is a legal transaction." "Legal?" The stranger's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Show me the papers that say it's legal to sell children like cattle. Show me the law that says a man can auction off human beings for the highest bidder." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, hands moving toward weapons, but none of them seemed eager to be the first to draw on this dangerous-looking newcomer. Emma held her breath, afraid to hope, but unable to stop herself from believing that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come to help them. "Besides," the stranger added with a smile that held no warmth, "I'm Jake Morrison, and this here's my town. What happens in Millbrook is my business, whether I like it or not." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Emma had heard stories about Jake Morrison, the rancher who'd built an empire in the mountains outside town. They said he was fair, but ruthless, a man who protected what was his with deadly efficiency. They also said he had no patience for men who preyed on the weak. Bradley's bluster crumbled like a house of cards. "Now, Mr. Morrison, this is all perfectly legal. The girl's guardian signed papers giving me authority to—" "Henry Walsh?" Morrison's voice cut through Bradley's explanation like a blade. "That worthless drunk sold his own nieces?" His gray eyes found Emma's across the room, and for a moment, she saw something that looked like genuine concern. "How old are you, girl?" Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. 16, sir. My sisters are 12 and 8. Morrison's jaw tightened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Sisters? You mean there are more children involved in this transaction?" Bradley began backing toward the bar. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "The other 2 are downstairs. It's all legal, I tell you. Walsh had debts, and this was the only way to settle them." Debts. Morrison repeated the word like it tasted foul. "And you thought the best way to settle debts was to sell children to a room full of drunks and degenerates?" The lieutenant who'd been bidding stepped forward, his hand on his saber. "Now see here, Morrison. We're all respectable men here. No one's talking about anything improper." Morrison's eyes fixed on the officer with laser intensity. "Respectable men don't bid on children at midnight auctions, Lieutenant. Respectable men don't frequent establishments that trade in human misery." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But then again, I've heard stories about what some cavalry units consider acceptable behavior when they think no one's watching." The lieutenant's face went white, and he took a step back. Emma realized that Morrison knew exactly who these men were and what they were capable of. More importantly, he didn't seem to care about their ranks or status. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Everyone in this room is going to walk out that door and forget this night ever happened. The girls are coming with me, and Bradley here is going to explain to Henry Walsh that his debt collection methods just earned him a one-way ticket out of Colorado." One of the miners, emboldened by whiskey and greed, stepped forward with his hand on his gun. "You can't just walk in here and steal our property. We paid good money." Morrison's draw was so fast, Emma barely saw it happen. One moment his hand was at his side. The next, his Colt was pointed directly at the miner's chest. The man froze, his own weapon only halfway out of its holster. "Property?" Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. "Did you just call a 16-year-old girl your property?" The miner's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. "And that tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, the miner slowly moved his hand away from his gun and raised both hands in surrender. The rest of the men in the room seemed to collectively exhale. "Smart choice," Morrison said, holstering his weapon with the same fluid motion he'd used to draw it. "Now, like I said, everyone out. This establishment is closed for business." The exodus was swift and silent. Men who'd been confident and aggressive moments before now scurried toward the door like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Even the lieutenant, for all his military bearing, couldn't get out fast enough. Bradley tried to follow the crowd, but Morrison's voice stopped him cold. "Not you, Bradley. You and I need to have a conversation about what happens to men who traffic in children." Emma watched in amazement as the saloon emptied, leaving only her, Morrison, and a visibly terrified Bradley. The sudden quiet felt surreal after the chaos and noise of the auction. Morrison turned to Emma. his expression softening slightly. "What's your name, miss?" "Emma," she managed, her voice stronger now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed. "Emma Walsh. These men. They have my sisters locked in the cellar." Morrison nodded grimly. "We'll get them out. But first..." He turned back to Bradley, who was pressed against the bar like he was trying to melt into the wood. "Keys, now." Bradley fumbled in his pocket and produced a ring of keys with shaking hands. Morrison snatched them and tossed them to Emma. "Go get your sisters. Take them outside and wait by my horse. The big gray stallion tied up out front." Emma caught the keys and hesitated. "What about him?" She nodded toward Bradley. Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "Mr. Bradley and I are going to discuss his future career prospects. Don't worry about what you might hear. Just get your sisters and wait outside." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She climbed down from the platform on unsteady legs and hurried toward the cellar door. Behind her, she heard Morrison's voice, low and menacing, as he began his conversation with Bradley. The cellar was pitch black, but Emma could hear her sisters breathing in the darkness. "Lucy? Sarah? It's me. We're getting out of here." "Emma?" Lucy's voice was thick with tears. "We heard shouting and breaking wood. What happened?" Emma fumbled with the keys until she found one that fit the lock on their makeshift prison. The door swung open, and she gathered her sisters into her arms, feeling their small bodies shake with relief and residual fear. "A man came," Emma whispered, not trusting her voice to stay steady. "A rancher named Morrison. He stopped the auction. We're safe." Sarah, the youngest, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are we really safe? Or is this just another bad dream?" Emma's heart broke a little at the question. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes, just sometimes, people did the right thing simply because it was right? How could she tell her baby sister that maybe, for the first time in months, they might actually be safe? "We're really safe," she said instead, hoping with everything in her heart that it was true. "Come on, let's go outside." They climbed the stairs together, Emma's arms around both her sisters, and stepped into the saloon's main room. Morrison was standing over Bradley, who was sitting on the floor holding his nose. Blood trickled between his fingers, and his eyes were already starting to swell shut. Morrison looked up as they entered. "Everything all right, ladies?" Emma nodded, unable to find words. This man, this stranger, had walked into hell and dragged them out without asking for anything in return. She'd never met anyone like him. "Good," Morrison said, straightening his shirt. "Let's get you someplace safe. Bradley here was just telling me how sorry he is for his poor judgment tonight. Weren't you, Bradley?" Bradley mumbled something that might have been an apology through his broken nose. Morrison guided them toward the destroyed saloon doors. "My horse is right outside. We'll take you back to my ranch tonight, get you cleaned up and fed. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent." As they stepped into the cool night air, Emma felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The stars seemed brighter somehow, and the mountain air tasted like freedom. Morrison's gray stallion stood patiently, tied to the hitching post, a magnificent animal that looked as untamed and dangerous as its owner. Morrison helped the girls mount up, Sarah riding in front, Lucy behind Emma, and Morrison taking the reins. As they rode away from the Golden Saloon, Emma looked back once at the broken doors and shattered windows. Whatever her future held, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. And for the first time since her mother's death, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The ranch house appeared through the darkness like something out of a dream, warm light spilling from its windows and smoke curling from the chimney. Emma had never seen anything so welcoming in her life. As they approached, she noticed other buildings scattered around the property, barns and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Morrison brought the horse to a stop in front of the main house and helped them down. "Maria!" he called toward the house. "We've got guests." The front door opened, revealing a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She took one look at the three dirty, frightened girls and immediately understood the situation. "Ay, Dios mío," she whispered, hurrying down the steps. "What has happened to these pobrecitas?" "Long story," Morrison said grimly. "They need food, baths, and safe places to sleep. Can you handle that while I take care of some business in town?" Maria's eyes flashed with protective fury as she gathered the girls toward the house. "Of course. Come, niñas, let Maria take care of you." As they were led inside, Emma heard Morrison speaking quietly to someone else, another man whose voice she didn't recognize. She caught fragments of their conversation. "Need to find Henry Walsh. Make sure this never happens again. Telegraph the territorial marshal." The house was warm and bright, filled with the smell of baking bread and wood smoke. Maria led them to a kitchen dominated by a massive stove and a table that looked like it could seat a small army. Without being asked, she began ladling soup into bowls and cutting thick slices of bread. "Eat," she commanded gently. "Everything else can wait until you have food in your stomachs." Emma wanted to ask questions, wanted to know what would happen to them next, but the soup was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, and for the first time in days, she felt truly warm. Lucy and Sarah ate with the desperate hunger of children, who'd been denied proper meals for too long. As they ate, Maria bustled around the kitchen, preparing baths and laying out clean clothes. She spoke softly in Spanish, words that Emma didn't understand, but that sounded like prayers or blessings. "Señor Morrison," Maria said when he returned an hour later, "I have prepared the guest rooms. The niñas will be safe here." Morrison nodded, his expression still grim from whatever business he'd conducted in town. "Good. Girls, you'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." Emma looked up from her soup. "What about Uncle Henry? What happens when he comes looking for us?" Morrison's smile was cold as January wind. "Henry Walsh won't be bothering anyone for a long time. Let's just say he's decided to pursue opportunities in other territories." Emma didn't ask for details. She was learning that Jake Morrison was the kind of man who solved problems permanently and didn't feel the need to explain his methods. As Maria led them upstairs to clean rooms with actual beds and warm blankets, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not just physical safety, but the deeper security that came from being protected by someone who had both the power and the will to keep them from harm. She lay in the soft bed that night, listening to her sister's peaceful breathing in the next room, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Whatever it was, it had to be better than the cellar of the Golden Saloon. And for the first time since her mother's death, Emma allowed herself to hope that their story might have a happy ending after all. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, dancing across Emma's face and pulling her from the deepest sleep she'd experienced in months. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the cracked ceiling of Uncle Henry's shack or the damp stone walls of the saloon cellar. Instead, she found herself in a room with polished wooden floors, cheerful yellow wallpaper decorated with tiny wildflowers, and furniture that looked like it had been crafted by someone who cared about beauty as well as function. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted up from downstairs, making her stomach rumble with genuine hunger, rather than the desperate gnawing she'd grown accustomed to. Through the window, she could see rolling pastures dotted with cattle, and beyond them, the purple peaks of the Rocky Mountains rising like ancient guardians against the morning sky. A soft knock on the door interrupted her observations. "Emma?" Lucy's voice was tentative, uncertain. "Are you awake?" "Come in," Emma called, sitting up in the soft bed. Her sister appeared in the doorway, clean and dressed in a simple blue dress that actually fit properly. Behind her, Sarah peeked around the doorframe, her hair braided with a yellow ribbon and her face scrubbed pink. "Maria gave us new clothes," Lucy said, smoothing down her skirt self-consciously. "She said our old ones needed washing, but I think she just burned them. I saw smoke coming from behind the kitchen." Emma couldn't blame Maria for that decision. Their clothes had been little better than rags, stained with mud, fear, and memories they were all better off forgetting. "You both look beautiful," she said, meaning every word. For the first time in months, her sisters looked like children instead of survivors. Sarah climbed onto the bed beside Emma, snuggling close like she used to do when thunderstorms frightened her. "Emma, are we really safe here? Or is this just a nice dream before something bad happens again?" The question hit Emma like a physical blow. How could she answer when she wasn't entirely sure herself? Yesterday felt like a miracle, but miracles had a way of turning into nightmares when you least expected it. Still, looking at her sister's hopeful face, she chose to believe in the possibility of safety. "I think we're really safe," she said, stroking Sarah's freshly washed hair. "Mr. Morrison doesn't seem like the kind of man who makes promises he can't keep." A gentle rap on the door interrupted them. "Niñas?" Maria's voice was warm and patient. "Breakfast is ready when you are. There is no hurry, but the food grows cold." Emma helped her sisters straighten their new clothes and followed them downstairs. The kitchen was filled with morning light and the comfortable sounds of a home where people actually cared for each other. Maria stood at the stove, turning bacon in a massive iron skillet, while a girl about Lucy's age sat at the kitchen table, sketching in a leather-bound book. The girl looked up as they entered, and Emma was struck by her resemblance to Jake Morrison. She had the same steel-gray eyes and determined jaw, though her features were softened by youth and a warmth that her father kept carefully hidden. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and she wore practical clothes suitable for ranch work. "You must be Emma," the girl said, closing her sketchbook and standing. "I'm Rebecca Morrison. Papa told me about what happened last night." Her expression darkened. "I wish I could have been there to help kick down that door." Emma found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. There was something refreshing about Rebecca's straightforward manner, a confidence that spoke of someone who'd never had to question her own worth or safety. "Thank you, and thank your father for us. We don't know how to repay what he's done." Rebecca waved dismissively. "Papa says the best way to repay kindness is to pass it along to someone else who needs it. Besides, this ranch is too quiet with just us grown-ups around. It'll be nice having other girls here." Maria set plates piled high with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of toast in front of them. The food was cooked perfectly, seasoned with care, and served with a generosity that made Emma's throat tight with gratitude. As they ate, Rebecca chattered about life on the ranch, pointing out the window to show them different buildings and explaining what happened in each one. "That's the main barn where we keep the horses," she said, gesturing toward a massive structure, painted red with white trim. "Papa says I can teach you to ride if you want. And over there is the bunkhouse where the ranch hands live. Most of them are good men, but Papa made it clear that anyone who even looks at you girls wrong will be looking for work elsewhere." The casual way Rebecca mentioned her father's protection made Emma realize that this wasn't just charity. Morrison had made a commitment to their safety, and from what she'd seen of the man, his commitments were as solid as the mountains surrounding his ranch. After breakfast, Rebecca led them on a tour of the property. The Morrison Ranch was like a small town unto itself, with buildings for every conceivable purpose. There was a blacksmith shop where a massive man named Tom shaped horseshoes on an anvil, a smokehouse filled with hanging meat, and even a small schoolhouse where Rebecca said a teacher came twice a week to instruct the ranch children. "Papa believes education is important," Rebecca explained as they walked past the schoolhouse. "He says ignorance is the worst kind of poverty because it follows you everywhere you go." Emma thought about her own interrupted education. She could read and write well enough, thanks to her mother's insistence, but there were vast gaps in her knowledge. The idea of sitting in a real classroom again, learning about things beyond mere survival, seemed almost impossibly luxurious. They spent the morning exploring, and Emma began to understand the scope of Morrison's operation. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a carefully constructed world where people could live and work with dignity. She saw families in the workers' quarters, children playing in carefully maintained yards, and women hanging laundry that was clean and whole rather than patched and repatched like everything she'd known. Around midday, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Rebecca shaded her eyes with her hand, studying the riders. "That's Papa and Dr. Mills," she said. "I wonder what brings the doctor out here." Emma's stomach clenched with sudden worry. "Is someone hurt?" "I don't think so," Rebecca said, though she looked concerned. "Dr. Mills is a good friend of the family. She probably just wanted to check on you girls." As the riders approached, Emma got her first good look at Jake Morrison in daylight. He was even more imposing than she'd remembered, sitting his horse, with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Beside him rode a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Morrison dismounted and approached them, his expression serious but not unkind. "Ladies, I'd like you to meet Dr. Catherine Mills. She's the finest physician in 3 counties, and she's offered to examine you girls just to make sure you're all right after your ordeal." Dr. Mills stepped forward with a reassuring smile. "It's purely precautionary," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to putting frightened patients at ease. "I just want to make sure you haven't suffered any injuries that need attention. Sometimes shock can mask pain or illness." Emma appreciated the doctor's directness. Too many adults talked around children as if they couldn't handle the truth. But Dr. Mills spoke to them like they had sense and deserved honest answers. The examination took place in Morrison's study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk. Dr. Mills was thorough but gentle, checking their reflexes, listening to their hearts and lungs, and asking careful questions about how they'd been treated over the past months. When she finished, Dr. Mills spoke privately with Morrison, while Maria gave the girls milk and fresh-baked cookies in the kitchen. Emma tried not to worry about what the doctor might have found, but she couldn't help noticing the serious expressions on both adults' faces. Finally, Dr. Mills returned to the kitchen and sat down across from Emma. "You're all in remarkably good health considering what you've been through," she said. "A little malnourished, some minor injuries that are healing well, but nothing that good food and rest won't cure." Emma felt relief wash over her like cool water. "Thank you, Dr. Mills, for everything." The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you have any other family? Anyone who might be looking for you or who might try to claim guardianship?" Emma's blood turned to ice. She'd been so focused on escaping Uncle Henry that she hadn't thought about other relatives who might surface to claim them. "Our mother had a sister in Kansas, but we haven't heard from her in years. Our father died when Sarah was just a baby, and Mama's parents passed before I was born." Dr. Mills nodded, making notes in a small leather journal. "What about your father's family?" "Uncle Henry was Papa's only brother," Emma said. "Mama used to say the Walsh men were either saints or sinners, with no middle ground. Papa was the saint." Morrison, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "What Dr. Mills is getting at is that we need to establish your legal status. Henry Walsh signed papers giving Bradley authority over you, but those papers were obtained through fraud and coercion. We need to make sure you're legally protected." Emma felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "What does that mean for us?" Dr. Mills exchanged a look with Morrison before answering. "It means we need to petition the territorial court to have you declared wards of the state, with Mr. Morrison as your legal guardian. It's the only way to ensure that no one else can claim authority over you." The word guardian sent a chill through Emma. She'd had a guardian before, and it had led to the auction block. What if we don't want a guardian? What if we just want to take care of ourselves? Morrison's expression softened slightly. Emma, you're 16 years old. In 2 years, you'll be legally an adult and can make your own decisions. But Lucy and Sarah need protection until they come of age. The law requires that they have someone responsible for their welfare. And you'd be willing to do that? Emma asked, studying his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. Take on the responsibility of 3 girls you barely know? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested old pain. I had a daughter once, he said simply. She and her mother died of fever when Rebecca was just a baby. I couldn't save them, couldn't protect them from something I couldn't fight. He looked directly at Emma. But I can fight men like Bradley and Henry Walsh. I can make sure you girls have the chance to grow up safe and whole. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. This wasn't about charity or pity. This was about a man who understood loss and was determined to prevent it when he could. Dr. Mills cleared, her throat gently. There's something else we need to discuss, she said. The territorial marshal is investigating what happened at the Golden Saloon. He'll want to interview you girls about your experiences with Henry Walsh and what you witnessed last night. Emma's hands clenched involuntarily. The thought of having to relive those memories, of describing the fear and helplessness she'd felt, made her stomach churn. Do we have to? Yes, Morrison said, his voice firm but kind. But you won't be alone. Dr. Mills and I will be there, and the marshal is a good man. He needs your testimony to make sure Bradley and anyone else involved face justice. The K. Next few hours passed in a blur of legal discussions and preparations. A lawyer arrived from town, a thin man with kind eyes who explained the guardianship process in terms that made sense. Papers were signed, statements were taken, and slowly, Emma began to understand that she and her sisters were being surrounded by a wall of legal protection that would be much harder to breach than the simple locks that had held them in the saloon, cellar. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Emma found herself in the strange position of belonging somewhere again. Rebecca chattered about her day. Maria fussed over making sure everyone had enough to eat, and Morrison asked thoughtful questions about how they were settling in. It was Sarah who broke the comfortable rhythm of the meal with an innocent question that cut straight to the heart of Emma's fears. Mr. Morrison, she said, looking up from her plate of roast beef and potatoes. What happens if you get tired? Of taking care of us? What happens if you decide you don't want us here anymore? The table fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Morrison set down his fork and looked directly at Sarah, his expression serious, but gentle. Sarah, do you see that mountain out there? He pointed through the window toward the highest peak visible in the distance. That mountain has been standing there for thousands of years, and it'll be standing there long after we're all gone. That's how permanent you are in this family now. Sarah considered this with the gravity that only an 8-year-old could bring to profound questions. But mountains can fall down. There are earthquakes and things. Morrison smiled, the first genuinely warm smile Emma had seen from him. You're right, they can. But it takes something pretty extraordinary to move a mountain. And I promise you, Sarah Walsh, that nothing ordinary will ever be enough to move you out of this family. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. It was the first time anyone had used their name as if it belonged somewhere, as if they were people worth keeping rather than burdens to be endured. After dinner, Morrison asked Emma to join him on the front porch while her sisters helped Maria with the dishes. The night air was cool and sweet, filled with the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the hills. You're worried about something, Morrison said without preamble. What is it? Emma wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the star-filled sky. "This is all too good to be true," she said finally. "In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is." Morrison leaned against the porch railing, studying her face in the lamplight spilling from the house. "What would convince you that it's real? That you're really safe here?" Emma thought about the question seriously. "Time, I guess. Proof that you mean what you say when things get difficult. When we're not new and interesting anymore. When we're just part of the daily routine with all the problems and annoyances that come with raising children." "That's a fair answer," Morrison said. "I can't prove intentions with words. Only time and actions will do that. But I can tell you this. I don't make commitments lightly, and I don't abandon them when they become inconvenient." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Finally, Emma spoke again. "Why us? Why risk getting involved in something that could have gotten you killed?" Morrison was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because sometimes you get a chance to do the right thing, and if you don't take it, you have to live with that choice for the rest of your life. I've made my share of mistakes, Emma, but letting children be sold like livestock wasn't going to be one of them." Emma understood then that Jake Morrison was a man haunted by his own sense of justice, driven by a code that demanded action when others might look away. It was both reassuring and slightly terrifying to be under the protection of someone with such unwavering principles. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you learn to be children again," Morrison said simply. "You go to school, you help with chores, you fight with your sisters over silly things, and worry about normal problems like whether your dress is pretty enough for church or if you'll pass your arithmetic test. You get to be ordinary, which is the most extraordinary gift I can give you." As they walked back inside, Emma caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The girl looking back at her was clean and well-fed, wearing a dress that fit properly and shoes that didn't have holes. But more than that, she looked like someone who belonged somewhere, someone who had a place in the world. For the first time, since her mother's death, Emma allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't ending in tragedy after all. Maybe it was just beginning. The schoolhouse bell chimed across the morning air as Emma walked alongside Rebecca toward the small wooden building that had become the center of her new world. 3 weeks had passed since that terrible night at the Golden Saloon, and she was still adjusting to the rhythm of normal life. The simple act of walking to school without fear, carrying books instead of worry, felt like stepping into someone else's dream. Lucy skipped ahead of them, her arithmetic slate tucked under one arm and her lunch pail swinging from the other. The transformation in her middle sister was remarkable. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity of a 12-year-old discovering that learning could be pleasure rather than punishment. Sarah, meanwhile, clung to Emma's hand with less desperation now, though she still preferred to stay close when venturing beyond the ranch house. "Miss Anderson is bringing new books today," Rebecca announced, adjusting the strap of her leather satchel. "Papa ordered them from Denver. Real literature books with stories from all over the world." Emma felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Books had been a luxury she couldn't afford to think about during the long months with Uncle Henry, but here at the ranch, reading was encouraged, even expected. Morrison's study was filled with volumes on everything from cattle breeding to Shakespeare, and he'd made it clear that the girls were welcome to borrow anything that caught their interest. The schoolhouse was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Miss Anderson, a young woman with soft brown hair and an infectious enthusiasm for learning, greeted each student personally as they entered. She was only a few years older than Emma, having come west from Boston with dreams of bringing education to frontier children. "Good morning, Emma," Miss Anderson said warmly. "I have something special for you today. A new student will be joining us, someone closer to your age." Emma looked around the room, which was typically filled with children ranging from 6 to 14. In the back corner, she spotted an unfamiliar figure bent over a book. The newcomer was a young woman with distinctive features that spoke of mixed heritage, her black hair braided with colorful ribbons and her dress a careful blend of traditional and modern styles. "That's Anna Chen," Rebecca whispered as they took their seats. "Her family runs the boarding house in town. She's been helping her parents with the business, but Papa convinced them she should finish her education." Emma studied the girl with interest. Anna looked to be about her own age, perhaps a year younger, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet determination that Emma recognized in herself. When Miss Anderson called for introductions, Anna stood with grace and confidence. "My name is Anna Chen," she said in clear, unaccented English. "My family came here from California, and before that my grandparents came from China. I speak 3 languages and can help with mathematics and bookkeeping." Emma was impressed by Anna's straightforward presentation. There was no apology in her voice for being different, no attempt to minimize her abilities. It was refreshing after so many years of being told to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. During the lunch break, Emma found herself sitting beside Anna under the large oak tree that shaded one side of the schoolhouse. The other girl was sketching in a small notebook, her pencil moving with confident strokes across the paper. "That's beautiful," Emma said, glancing at the drawing. It was a detailed rendering of the mountains visible from the schoolyard, captured with an artist's eye for light and shadow. Anna smiled, closing the notebook carefully. "Thank you. My grandmother taught me before she died. She said that drawing helps you really see the world instead of just looking at it." Emma understood that distinction better than she might have a month ago. For so long, she'd been focused purely on survival, on just getting through each day. Now she was beginning to notice details again, the way morning light painted the mountains purple and gold, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the feel of clean clothes against her skin. "Rebecca told me about what happened to you," Anna said quietly. "About the auction and how Mr. Morrison saved you." Emma tensed slightly, unsure how much she wanted to discuss those memories, even with someone who seemed kind. "What did she tell you?" "Just that you and your sisters needed help, and that Mr. Morrison provided it. She didn't give details, and I didn't ask for them." Anna's voice was gentle but firm. "I know what it's like to be different, to have people think they can treat you however they want because you don't have power to stop them." Emma looked at Anna more carefully, seeing something in her expression that spoke of shared understanding. "What happened to you?" Anna was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "When we first came to Millbrook, some people thought a Chinese family didn't belong here. They tried to run us out of town, said we were taking opportunities, away from real Americans. One night, they threw rocks through our windows and painted ugly words on our building." Emma felt anger rise in her chest on Anna's behalf. "What did you do?" "We stayed," Anna said simply. "Papa said that running away just teaches bullies that their methods work. We fixed our windows, painted over the words, and kept serving the best meals in town. Eventually, people realized we weren't going anywhere, and most of them started treating us with respect." Emma admired Anna's family's courage, but she couldn't help thinking about the differences in their situations. Anna's family had each other and a business that provided both income and status in the community. Emma and her sisters had been alone and powerless, with no resources except their own determination. "It's different when you're children," Emma said. "When you don't have any legal rights or economic power. Adults can do whatever they want to you, and there's no one to stop them." Anna nodded thoughtfully. "That's true, but you stopped them, didn't you? You got your sisters out of that situation. You found a way to survive until help came." Emma had never thought of it that way before. In her mind, she'd failed because she couldn't prevent the auction from happening in the first place. But Anna was right. She had fought back in the only way available to her, and she had kept her sisters alive until Morrison arrived. Their conversation was interrupted by the school bell calling students back to afternoon lessons. As they walked toward the building, Anna touched Emma's arm gently. "My mother always says that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every time you fall. You've gotten back up, Emma. That makes you stronger than you think." The afternoon passed quickly with lessons in history and literature. Miss Anderson read aloud from a book of poetry, her voice bringing the words to life in a way that made Emma's heart soar. When she was dismissed for the day, Emma felt the peculiar satisfaction that came from learning something new, from expanding the boundaries of her world through education. On the walk home, Sarah chattered excitedly about a story Miss Anderson had told about brave princesses and magical kingdoms. Lucy showed off the arithmetic problems she'd solved correctly, beaming with pride at her accomplishment. Emma listened to her sisters with a mixture of joy and melancholy, remembering when she'd been young enough to find such simple pleasure in academic achievement. The ranch came into view as they crested the small hill that overlooked the valley. Emma never tired of this moment, when the sprawling collection of buildings appeared like a miniature town nestled against the mountain backdrop. Smoke rose from several chimneys, cattle dotted the pastures, and she could see ranch hands going about their evening chores with practiced efficiency. Morrison was waiting for them on the front porch, his expression more serious than usual. Beside him stood a man Emma didn't recognize, wearing a badge and the travel-stained clothes of someone who'd ridden hard to get here. "Girls," Morrison called as they approached. "Come inside. There's someone I need you to meet." Emma's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Official visitors rarely brought good news, and the marshal's presence suggested that their peaceful interlude might be coming to an end. The man introduced himself as Marshal Robert Hayes, a lean, weathered individual with kind eyes and a mustache that needed trimming. He removed his hat as they entered the house, his manner respectful but businesslike. "I apologize for disturbing your routine," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position tempered by genuine concern. "But I need to speak with you girls about what happened in town. We've been investigating the situation at the Golden Saloon, and your testimony is crucial for building our case." Emma felt her sisters move closer to her, their earlier cheerfulness evaporating in the face of this reminder of their ordeal. She placed protective arms around both Lucy and Sarah, drawing strength from their need for her protection. "What kind of case?" Emma asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Marshal Hayes glanced at Morrison, who nodded encouragingly. "We're pursuing charges against Tom Bradley for human trafficking, conspiracy, and operating an illegal auction. We also want to bring charges against Henry Walsh for child endangerment and fraud." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "You found Uncle Henry." "Not yet," the marshal admitted. "But we've traced his movements to a mining camp outside Denver. It's only a matter of time before we bring him in." The thought of Uncle Henry in custody should have filled Emma with satisfaction, but instead, she felt only a weary sadness. Punishing him wouldn't undo the months of fear and degradation he'd put them through. It wouldn't erase the memory of standing on that auction platform while men bid on her like she was livestock. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "Marshal." Hayes pulled out a notebook and pencil. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about how Henry Walsh came to have custody of you, how he treated you, and what led up to the auction. I know it's difficult, but the more details you can provide, the stronger our case will be." Emma looked at her sisters, seeing the fear creeping back into their eyes. They'd worked so hard to put that nightmare behind them, and now they were being asked to relive every painful moment for the sake of justice. Morrison seemed to sense her hesitation. "Emma, you don't have to do this if you're not ready. The law gives us other options." "No," Emma said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "We'll tell you what happened. If it helps prevent other children from going through what we did, then it's worth it." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of Emma's life. Marshall Hayes was gentle but thorough, asking questions that forced her to remember details she'd tried to forget. Lucy contributed what she could, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Sarah mostly stayed silent, but when the marshal asked about their treatment at Uncle Henry's house, she spoke up with startling clarity. "He used to lock us in the root cellar when he was angry," Sarah said, her small voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. "Sometimes for whole days. It was dark and cold, and there were spiders. Emma used to tell us stories to make us less scared." Emma felt tears burn behind her eyes as she remembered those long hours in the darkness, trying to keep her sister's spirits up while fighting her own despair. She'd told them fairy tales and made-up adventures, anything to distract them from their fear and hunger. Marshall Hayes wrote everything down carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When they finished, he closed his notebook and looked directly at Emma. "You girls are incredibly brave," he said. "What you've told me today will help ensure that Bradley and Walsh face the full consequences of their actions." After the marshal left, promising to keep them informed of his progress, the family gathered in the parlor for their evening routine. Morrison read aloud from a book of adventure stories while Maria worked on her mending and Rebecca sketched in her drawing pad. The familiar ritual helped ease the tension that the marshal's visit had created. Later, as Emma was preparing for bed, Morrison knocked on her door. She opened it to find him holding a small wrapped package. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing her the package. "Consider it a reward for your courage today." Emma unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. The pages were crisp and clean, waiting for her thoughts and dreams to fill them. "I noticed you like to write," Morrison said. "Maria mentioned that you've been helping Sarah with her letters by making up stories. This might give you a place to put those stories where they won't get lost." Emma ran her fingers over the smooth leather, feeling the weight of possibility in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this and for everything else." Morrison's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me, Emma. You've already given this family more than you know. Your strength, your determination to protect your sisters, the way you've helped them adjust to life here, that's worth more than any favor I could do for you." That night, Emma sat by her window with the journal open on her lap, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she had a future worth writing about. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined the ending. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. "My name is Emma Walsh, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes, when everything seems lost, the most extraordinary people appear to show you that hope is not just a dream, but a choice you can make every single day." Outside her window, the ranch settled into peaceful slumber, protected by mountains that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Emma smiled and continued writing, finally ready to tell her story on her own terms. The courthouse in Denver loomed before Emma like a fortress of red brick and imposing windows, its clock tower reaching toward gray autumn clouds that promised snow before nightfall. She stood on the courthouse steps between Morrison and Dr. Mills, watching. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air while her stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Today, after months of legal proceedings and delays, Tom Bradley would finally face trial for what he'd done to them. Lucy and Sarah waited in the hotel room with Maria, spared from having to testify by the judge's ruling that Emma's account would be sufficient. Emma was grateful for that small mercy. Her sisters had made remarkable progress in putting their ordeal behind them, and she saw no reason to force them to relive those memories in front of a courtroom full of strangers. "Remember," Dr. Mills said quietly, adjusting Emma's dark blue dress one final time, "you're not on trial here. You're simply telling the truth about what happened. That's all anyone can ask of you." Emma nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts. The dress was new, purchased specifically for this occasion, and it made her feel older, more serious. Morrison had insisted that she look like the respectable young woman she was, not the frightened child Bradley had tried to auction off like chattel. Marshal Hayes appeared at the courthouse entrance, his badge gleaming in the pale sunlight. Over the past months, Emma had grown to trust the weathered lawman who had pursued Bradley with dogged determination. His investigation had uncovered a network of similar auctions throughout the territory, making Emma realize that what had happened to them was part of a much larger and more sinister operation. The defendant arrived an hour ago, Hayes informed them as they climbed the courthouse steps. His lawyer's been trying to negotiate a plea agreement, but the prosecutor's not interested. This case is going to trial. Emma felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and nervousness at this news. Part of her wanted Bradley to face the full consequences of his actions, but another part wished she could simply put the whole nightmare behind her without having to confront him again. The courtroom was smaller than Emma had expected, with wooden benches arranged in neat rows and tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. She took her seat in the front row, acutely aware of the curious stares from the handful of spectators who had come to witness the proceedings. News of the case had spread throughout the territory, making it something of a sensation in the local newspapers. When Bradley was led into the courtroom in shackles, Emma barely recognized him, the confident, predatory man who had terrorized her in the saloon cellar had been replaced by someone who looked defeated and older than his years. His clothes were clean but ill-fitting, and his once imposing bulk seemed diminished somehow. He glanced in her direction once, but quickly looked away when their eyes met. The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Foster, who had traveled from the territorial capital specifically to handle this case. She had spent considerable time with Emma over the past weeks, preparing her testimony and explaining what to expect. Emma appreciated Foster's straightforward manner and her obvious commitment to seeing justice done. Bradley's defense attorney was a nervous young man who seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the charges his client faced. During his opening statement, he attempted to portray Bradley as merely a businessman who had been misled by Henry Walsh about the girl's circumstances. Emma felt anger rise in her chest at this characterization, but Morrison's steady presence beside her helped keep her emotions in check. When Emma was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with her head held high, drawing strength from everything she had learned about herself over the past months. She was no longer the terrified girl who had cowered in that cellar. She was Emma Walsh, student, sister, and survivor, and she had a story to tell. Prosecutor Foster guided her through her testimony with gentle but thorough questions. Emma described the months of neglect and abuse at Uncle Henry's hands, the terrifying night when they were dragged to the Golden Saloon, and the horror of standing on that platform while men bid on her like she was livestock for sale. "What went through your mind during the auction?" Foster asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. Emma took a deep breath, remembering that terrible moment when she had believed all hope was lost. "I thought about my mother," she said clearly. "I had promised her I would protect my sisters, and I felt like I was failing them in the worst possible way. I thought about how scared Lucy and Sarah must be, waiting in that cellar, not knowing what was going to happen to them. Did you believe you had any options at that point? Any way to escape your situation?" "No," Emma said simply. "I felt completely powerless. These were grown men with money and weapons, and I was just a 16-year-old girl with no one to help." "As," Foster nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "What happened next?" Emma's voice grew stronger as she described Morrison's dramatic entrance, the way he had faced down a room full of armed men without hesitation, and how he had demanded their freedom with an authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Morrison didn't know you before that night, is that correct?" "That's right. We were complete strangers to him. And yet he risked his life to help you. Why do you think he did that?" Emma glanced at Morrison, who sat quietly in the front row, his expression unreadable. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said. "Because children shouldn't be bought and sold like cattle, no matter what their circumstances." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that Emma might be exaggerating the danger she had faced, but his questions only served to underscore the horror of the situation. When he asked if she had been actually harmed during the auction, Emma's response was swift and cutting. "Sir, the act of putting children up for sale to the highest bidder is harm in itself. The fact that Mr. Morrison arrived before anyone could complete their purchase doesn't diminish the evil of what was being attempted." The attorney seemed to realize he was only making things worse for his client and quickly concluded his questioning. Other witnesses followed, including Marshall Hayes, who described the evidence he had gathered, and Dr. Mills, who testified about the girls' physical and emotional condition when she first examined them. Morrison also took the stand. His testimony, delivered in the same calm, authoritative tone that had dominated the saloon that night. When asked why he had intervened, Morrison's answer was characteristically direct. "I've seen what happens to children who fall through the cracks of society," he said. "I've seen them broken and discarded by adults who should have protected them. When I walked into that saloon and saw what was happening, I knew I had a choice. I could look the other way and tell myself it wasn't my business, or I could act on my principles. For me, it wasn't really a choice at all." The trial lasted 3 days, and on the final afternoon, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Emma held her breath as the foreman stood to announce their decision. "We find the defendant, Thomas Bradley, guilty on all charges." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by something she hadn't expected: sadness. Seeing Bradley convicted didn't erase what had happened to them, didn't give her back the months of fear and uncertainty they had endured. It was justice, but it was also just one chapter in a much larger story. The judge sentenced Bradley to 15 years in the territorial prison, making it clear that crimes against children would be met with the full force of the law. As Bradley was led away in shackles, he looked once more in Emma's direction, and she saw something in his eyes. That might have been regret. Outside the courthouse, as snow began to fall in lazy flakes that melted on the warm brick steps, Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters wanting to interview the brave young woman who had helped bring a child trafficker to justice. Morrison and Dr. Mills formed a protective barrier around her, politely but firmly declining all requests for interviews. "This isn't about publicity," Morrison told one particularly persistent reporter. "It's about justice being served, and 3, young ladies being able to move forward with their lives." The train ride back to Millbrook gave Emma time to process everything that had happened. As the Colorado landscape rolled past the window, painted in the golden colors of late autumn, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible night at the Golden Saloon. Lucy and Sarah were thriving at the ranch, their laughter and energy filling the house with joy that had been absent for too long. Lucy had discovered a talent for mathematics that impressed even Morrison, while Sarah had bonded with the ranch animals in a way that suggested she might follow in her guardian's footsteps as a rancher. Emma herself had found her voice in ways she never could have imagined. Her journal had grown thick with stories and observations, and Miss Anderson had begun encouraging her to consider applying to the teacher training program in Denver. The idea of becoming an educator, of helping other children discover the joy of learning, appealed to Emma more than she could express. More importantly, she had learned that strength didn't come from never being afraid or never facing impossible situations. True strength came from finding the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless, from protecting those you loved even when you felt powerless to protect yourself. The ranch house appeared through the train window as they pulled into the Millbrook station, its windows glowing warmly in the early evening light. Emma could see figures moving on the front porch, and she knew that Maria, Rebecca, and the ranch hands were waiting to welcome them home. As they walked from the station to the waiting wagon, Anna Chen appeared beside them, having apparently been watching for their return. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. "Justice was served," Emma replied. And she meant it. Not just the legal justice of Bradley's conviction, but the deeper justice of 3 orphaned girls finding safety, love, and the chance to build meaningful lives. That evening, the ranch family gathered around the dinner table as they had so, many times before. Morrison said grace, thanking God for bringing them all together and asking for continued blessings on their home. As Emma looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to her, she marveled at the twists of fate that had led them to this moment. After dinner, she retreated to her room with her journal, intending to record her thoughts about the trial and its aftermath. Instead, she found herself writing about hope, how it could be lost and found again, how it could grow from the smallest acts of kindness, and how it could transform not just individuals but entire communities. She wrote about Morrison, whose courage and principles had saved them, but who also learned from them about the importance of family and the joy that children could bring to a home. She wrote about Maria, whose nurturing love had helped heal wounds that went deeper than any physical injury. She wrote about Rebecca, who had welcomed them as sisters without hesitation or jealousy. Most importantly, she wrote about her own transformation from a frightened girl trying to survive one day at a time to a young woman with dreams, goals, and the confidence to pursue them. The auction platform had been meant to be the end of her story, but instead, it had become the beginning of something far more beautiful than she could have imagined. A soft knock on her door interrupted her writing. Sarah appeared in the doorway, clutching her favorite doll and looking younger than her years in her white nightgown. "Emma, can you tell me a story? Not a sad one, but one with a happy ending?" Emma smiled, closing her journal and patting the bed beside her. "Come here, little sister. I'll tell you the best story I know." As Sarah snuggled close, Emma began to speak, her voice warm and confident in the lamplight. Once upon a time, there were 3 sisters who thought their story was ending in the worst possible way. But what they discovered was that every ending is really just a new beginning in disguise, and that the most beautiful chapters of their lives were still waiting to be written. Outside the window, snow continued to fall softly over the ranch, covering the landscape in pristine white that sparkled under the starlight. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, guardians of a valley where broken things could heal and lost children could find their way home. Emma continued her story, weaving together truth and hope, reality and dreams, creating a narrative that honored their past while celebrating their future. And as Sarah's breathing grew deep and even with sleep, Emma realized that this was what healing looked like, not the absence of painful memories, but the presence of enough love and safety to transform those memories into wisdom. The next morning brought news that would complete their transformation in an unexpected way. Marshal Hayes arrived with official documents bearing the territorial seal, along with a letter that would change everything. "It's from a lawyer in Kansas," Hayes explained as the family gathered in Morrison's study. "Seems your Aunt Margaret, your mother's sister, has been looking for you girls ever since she heard about your parents' deaths. She hired investigators to track you down after Henry Walsh disappeared." Emma's heart skipped a beat. They had family, real family, who had been searching for them all this time. Hayes continued reading from the letter. "She wants to know if you're safe and well cared for, and she's prepared to travel to Colorado to meet with you if you're interested." Emma looked at her sisters, seeing the same mixture of hope and uncertainty in their faces that she felt in her own heart. After everything they had been through, the idea of more family, more people who might care about them, was both wonderful and terrifying. Morrison's voice was gentle when he spoke. "The choice is yours, girls. Whatever you decide, you'll always have a home here. But if you want to meet your aunt, we can arrange that." Emma thought about her mother, about the sister she had mentioned so rarely that Emma had almost forgotten she existed. The idea of connecting with that part of their heritage, of learning more about where they came from, appealed to her greatly. "I think we'd like to meet her," Emma said finally. "But I want her to know that we already have a family here, people who love us and have given us everything we need to build good lives." Morrison's smile was proud and warm. I think that's exactly what she'd want to hear. 3 weeks later, Margaret Walsh Sullivan arrived in Millbrook on the afternoon train, a woman in her 40s with Emma's auburn hair and her mother's gentle eyes. The reunion was emotional, but comfortable, filled with stories about Emma's mother as a young woman and family history that filled in gaps the girls had never known existed. Aunt Margaret stayed for a week, and by the time she left, it was understood that she would be a presence in their lives, but not a disruption to the family they had built. She invited them to visit her in Kansas during the summer, and Emma found herself looking forward to that adventure. As spring returned to the Colorado mountains, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and new foals to the pastures, Emma stood once again on the ridge overlooking the ranch. But this time, she wasn't alone. Rebecca stood beside her, along with Anna, Chen, and several other friends from school, all of them young women with dreams and ambitions that extended far beyond the traditional roles society had planned for them. Emma had been accepted into the teacher training program and would begin her studies in the fall. Rebecca planned to study veterinary medicine, while Anna wanted to open her own business. They were part of a generation of women who refused to accept limitations on their potential, and they supported each other's dreams with fierce loyalty. "Do you ever think about that night at the saloon?" Rebecca asked quietly. "About how different things might have been if Papa hadn't walked through those doors?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I think about it," she said, "but not the way I used to. I used to think about it with anger and fear, replaying all the terrible things that could have happened. Now I think about it as the night when everything changed for the better. The night when I learned that there are people in this world who will stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." She paused, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. "But mostly, I think about how it taught me that we're never as powerless as we think we are. Even when we can't change our circumstances, we can still choose how we respond to them. We can still choose to protect the people we love, to hold on to hope, and to believe that tomorrow might be better than today." Anna smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the sunset. "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become, Emma, and your mother too." Emma felt the truth of those words settle into her heart like a blessing. She had become someone her parents would be proud of, but more importantly, she had become someone she could be proud of. The auction platform had been meant to strip away her dignity and agency, but instead, it had revealed strength she hadn't known she possessed. As the friends made their way back down the ridge toward the ranch house, where Maria was preparing one of her legendary dinners, and Morrison was reading to Sarah from a book of adventure stories, Emma felt a deep sense of completion. Not the ending of her story, but the end of one chapter and the confident beginning of the next. Her journal that night recorded not memories of trauma or fear, but plans for the future and gratitude for the present. She wrote about the teacher she hoped to become, the students she wanted to inspire, and the family she had helped to build through love, determination, and the refusal to give up hope. The last line of that entry would become something of a motto for her life. Every sunset promises a new dawn, and every ending carries within it the seeds of a new beginning. The key is having the courage to plant those seeds and tend them with love. Outside her window, the ranch settled into peaceful slumber under a blanket of stars that seemed to shine with extra brightness, as if the universe itself was celebrating. The transformation of 3 lost children into a family, bound not by blood alone, but by choice, courage, and unshakable love. Emma smiled as she closed her journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but confident now in her ability to meet whatever came with grace, strength, and the unwavering support of the people who had chosen to love her exactly as she was. 5 years had passed since that fateful night at the Golden Saloon, and Emma Morrison stood at the front of her own classroom, watching 23 eager faces absorb her lesson on American literature. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating the chalkboard where she had written a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." Emma had legally taken Morrison's name 2 years earlier when he formally adopted all 3 sisters, cementing what had already been true in their hearts for years. At 21, she was the youngest certified teacher in the Colorado Territory, having completed her training with distinction and returned to Millbrook to establish the region's first secondary school for girls. Her students came from all walks of life: ranchers' daughters, shopkeepers' children, and even the daughter of the Chinese family who ran the general store. Emma had insisted from the beginning that her classroom would welcome anyone willing to learn, regardless of their family's status or background. It was a philosophy that had initially raised eyebrows among some of the more traditional families, but the quality of education she provided had quickly silenced most criticism. Lucy, now 17 and serving as Emma's teaching assistant, moved quietly between the desks, helping younger students with their writing assignments. She had inherited their mother's gift for mathematics and was planning to attend the Women's College in Denver the following year. Her dream was to become an engineer, a profession almost unheard of for women, but Emma had learned never to underestimate her sister's determination. Sarah, at 13, was perhaps the most transformed of them all. The frightened little girl who had once clung to Emma's skirts had grown into a confident young woman with a natural gift for working with animals. She spent her afternoons in the ranch's veterinary clinic, learning from Dr. Mills and showing an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed even the most seasoned ranch hands. Emma paused in her lesson as a commotion outside caught her attention. Through the window, she could see riders approaching the schoolhouse at a gallop, dust clouds marking their urgent passage across the valley floor. Something about their haste made her stomach tighten with concern. "Class dismissed early today," she announced, trying to keep her voice calm. "Please complete the reading assignment for tomorrow, and remember that next week we'll be discussing your essays on women's suffrage." As her students filed out, chattering excitedly about the unexpected early dismissal, Emma stepped onto the schoolhouse porch. The riders were closer now, and she recognized Jake Morrison's gray stallion in the lead. Behind him rode Marshall Hayes and 2 men she didn't know, their expressions grim as they approached. Morrison dismounted with the fluid motion of someone who had spent decades in the saddle, but Emma noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested unconsciously on his gun. Whatever news he brought, it wasn't good. "Emma," he said, without preamble. "We need to talk. Is Lucy here?" "She's inside helping with the younger children. What's wrong?" Emma felt the familiar clench of anxiety in her chest, the old instinct to prepare for the worst. Marshall Hayes stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "We've had word from the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. Henry Walsh has been spotted in a mining camp about 50 miles north of here. He's been asking questions about you. Girls, trying to find out where you ended up." Emma's blood turned to ice. Henry Walsh, her uncle, the man who had sold them to Tom Bradley like cattle. She had almost convinced herself that he was gone forever, lost in the vast wilderness of the American frontier where men could disappear without a trace. "What kind of questions?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. One of the strangers, a lean man with a deputy's badge, spoke up. "He's been telling people that his nieces were kidnapped, that he's been searching for them for years. Claims he wants to bring them home where they belong." Emma felt a surge of rage so pure and hot that it surprised her. After everything they had built, everything they had accomplished, Henry Walsh thought he could simply waltz back into their lives and reclaim them like lost property. "He has no legal claim on us," she said firmly. Jake Morrison is our legal guardian. The territorial court confirmed it years ago." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's true, but Walsh isn't necessarily interested in what's legal. From what we've heard, he's been drinking heavily and telling anyone who'll listen that he was cheated out of his family. He's convinced himself that we stole you girls from him." Lucy appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, having obviously overheard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Her face was pale but determined as she joined Emma on the porch. "What do we do?" Lucy asked, her voice carrying the practical tone that had always been her strength. Emma looked at her sister, seeing not the terrified 12-year-old who had cowered in the saloon cellar, but a confident young woman who had never learned to back down from a challenge. The sight filled her with fierce pride, and an even fiercer determination to protect what they had built. "We prepare," Emma said simply, "and we make it clear that we're not the helpless children we used to be." Over the next 3 days, the ranch became a fortress of quiet preparation. Morrison called in favors from neighboring ranchers, assembling a network of men who would watch the roads and keep an eye out for strangers. Dr. Mills moved temporarily into the main house, bringing her medical supplies and her own small arsenal of weapons. Even Miss Anderson, the schoolteacher who had first encouraged Emma's love of learning, arrived with a carpet bag and a determined expression. Emma found herself oddly calm as they waited for news. She had faced Henry Walsh before and survived. She had stood on an auction block and lived to tell about it. Whatever he thought he could do to them now, he would find them far better prepared than he expected. Sarah took the news with a maturity that both impressed and saddened Emma. At 13, she should have been worried about school dances and childhood crushes, not preparing for a confrontation with an abusive relative who might try to drag her back into hell. "I remember him," Sarah said quietly as she and Emma checked the locks on the schoolhouse windows. "I remember how he used to look at us, like we were things that belonged to him instead of people with our own thoughts and feelings." Emma squeezed her sister's hand. "He can't hurt us anymore, Sarah. We're not alone and helpless now. We have people who love us, people who will fight for us." The confrontation came on a Thursday morning when the autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the mountains stood sharp and clear against a cloudless sky. Emma was teaching a lesson on poetry when Lucy burst through the classroom door, her face flushed with running. "Emma, they're here. Uncle Henry and 2 other men. They're at the ranch house demanding to see us." Emma felt her heart rate spike, but her voice remained calm as she addressed her students. "Class is dismissed. For today, please go directly home and stay there until you hear from me or your parents. Lucy, get Sarah and bring her to the house." As her students hurried away, some of them clearly sensing the danger in the air, Emma walked deliberately to her desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in soft leather, lay the Colt revolver that Morrison had given her on her 18th birthday. She had hoped never to need it, but Morrison had insisted that she learn to shoot, and she had discovered a natural aptitude for marksmanship. The weight of the gun in her hand was both comforting and sobering. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged to an auction block. She was Emma Morrison, teacher, sister, and protector of everything she held dear. The ranch house was surrounded by a tense circle of armed men when Emma arrived. Morrison stood on the front porch, his own weapon visible but not drawn, facing 3 mounted men whose horses stamped nervously in the charged atmosphere. Henry Walsh looked older than Emma remembered, his face weathered by years of hard living, and his clothes showing the wear of a man who had spent too much time in mining camps and saloons. But his eyes held the same cruel gleam that had haunted her nightmares for years. "There she is," Walsh called out when he spotted Emma approaching. "My niece, Emma. Come to take you girls home where you belong." Emma stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her hand resting casually on the butt of her revolver. "This is our home, Uncle Henry. We're exactly where we belong." Walsh's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Home? With these strangers? I'm your blood. Girl, Your family. These people just took advantage of a bad situation to steal what was mine." The casual way he referred to them as property made Emma's temper flare, but she kept her voice level. "We were never yours, Uncle Henry. Children aren't property to be owned or sold. We're human beings with the right to choose our own lives." One of Walsh's companions, a rough-looking man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Enough talk. Walsh says these girls belong to him, and we're here to collect them." Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "And I'm telling you that you have no legal authority here. These girls are under my protection, and they'll stay that way as long as I draw breath." Walsh's face twisted with rage. "Legal authority? You think I care about your laws? I raised these girls after their parents died. I fed them and clothed them, and this is how they repay me? Running off in the night and letting strangers turn them against their own blood?" Emma felt a surge of anger so powerful that it took all her self-control to keep from drawing her weapon. "You didn't raise us, Uncle Henry. You neglected us, abused us, and then sold us to pay your gambling debts. If Jake Morrison hadn't intervened that night, we would have been bought by the highest bidder and used in ways that would have destroyed us." Sarah appeared beside Emma, her young face set in lines of determination that made her look far older than her 13 years. "I remember what you did to us," she said, her clear voice carrying across the yard. "I remember the cellar and the hunger and the fear. I remember how you looked at Emma like she was something you could trade for whiskey money." Walsh's face turned an ugly shade of red. "You ungrateful little—" "Watch your tongue," Morrison interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You're talking to children under my protection." The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, but he found himself staring down the barrels of half a dozen rifles held by Morrison's ranch hands. The click of hammers being pulled back filled the air like deadly punctuation. Emma stepped forward, her own weapon now clearly visible. "You have a choice, Uncle Henry. You can turn around and ride away, never to bother us again. Or you can face the consequences of threatening the Morrison family." Walsh stared at her in disbelief. "You'd draw a gun on your own uncle?" "I'd draw a gun on anyone who threatened my family," Emma replied without hesitation. "And Jake Morrison is more of a father to us than you ever were an uncle." For a long moment, the two sides faced each other in tense silence. Emma could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of 5 years of healing and growth, all balanced on the edge of violence. Finally, Walsh seemed to understand that he was outnumbered and outgunned. With a curse, he yanked his horses, reins around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Blood calls to blood, and someday these girls will remember where they really belong." "They already know where they belong," Morrison said calmly. "And it's not with a man who would sell children to pay his debts." As Walsh and his companions rode away, Emma felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. She had finally faced the monster from her past and found him to be nothing more than a bitter, broken man who had never learned that strength came from protecting others, not exploiting them. Lucy and Sarah flanked her as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. "Is it really over?" Lucy asked quietly. Emma considered the question seriously. "I think it is," she said finally. "He's seen what we've become, what we're capable of. He knows he can't intimidate us anymore." That evening, the ranch family gathered for dinner as they had so many times before. But there was a new quality to their togetherness. They had faced a threat as a unit and emerged stronger for it. Emma looked around the table at the faces that had become her world. Morrison, whose steady strength had given them all a foundation to build on. Maria, whose nurturing love had helped heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. Rebecca, who had welcomed them as sisters without reservation. Dr. Mills, whose quiet competence had seen them through so many challenges. After dinner, Emma retreated to her study to work on her lesson plans for the following week. She had been invited to speak, At the Territorial Education Conference in Denver, sharing her experiences with establishing schools for girls in frontier communities. The invitation was both an honor and a validation of everything she had worked to achieve. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Morrison stood in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "May I come in?" Emma gestured to the chair, across from her desk. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Morrison settled into the chair, his movements showing the wear of years spent in hard physical labor, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened today, about how you handled yourself." Emma waited, unsure where the conversation was heading. "When I first brought you girls home," Morrison continued, "I thought I was saving 3 children who needed protection. What I didn't realize was that I was also saving myself." Emma looked at him with surprise. Morrison rarely spoke about his own feelings or needs. "After my first wife and daughter died," he went on, "I thought I was done with family. Thought I was too old and too set in my ways to open my heart again. But you girls taught me that love isn't something you run out of. The more you give, the more you have." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved us, Jake. In every way that matters." Morrison shook his head. "We saved each other. And today, watching you stand up to Henry Walsh, seeing the woman you've become, I've never been prouder of anything in my life." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared history and mutual affection filling the space between them. "There's something else," Morrison said eventually. "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens when you girls are all grown and making your own ways in the world." Emma felt a flutter of concern. "Are you worried about being alone?" Morrison laughed, a warm sound that filled the room. "Quite the opposite. I'm thinking about expanding. There are other children out there who need what we can provide. Safety, education, a chance to become whoever they're meant to be." Emma's heart leaped with excitement. "You want to turn the ranch into a school? A school, an orphanage, a haven for children who have nowhere else to go." "I've been talking to Dr. Mills and some of the other families in the area. There's support for the idea, and we have the resources to make it work." Emma felt a surge of possibility that made her almost dizzy. "It would be amazing. We could help so many children, give them the same chances we were given." Morrison smiled. "I was hoping you'd feel that way, because I can't think of anyone better suited to run such a place than someone who understands exactly what these children are going through." That night, Emma stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch, but this time she wasn't alone. Her sisters stood beside her, along with Rebecca and Anna Chen, who had returned from her studies in California to open a law practice in Denver. They were all young women now, each pursuing her own dreams while remaining connected by bonds that went deeper than blood. "Can you imagine it?" Lucy said, her eyes bright with excitement. "A place where children like we were can come to heal and learn and grow." Sarah, now as tall as Emma and showing signs of the beauty she would become, nodded thoughtfully. "We could teach them that their past doesn't have to define their future, that they're worth more than what others might think they're worth." Emma pulled her sisters close, marveling at how far they had all come. "We could call it the Morrison Institute," she said, "a place where every child learns that they have value, that they have potential, that they deserve to be protected and loved." Anna smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "And I could provide legal services to make sure they're all properly protected. No more Henry Walshes taking advantage of vulnerable children." Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Papa's going to need a bigger dining room table." As they made their way back down the ridge toward the ranch house, where warm light spilled from windows and the smell of Maria's baking filled the air, Emma thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with terror and helplessness, continued through healing and growth, and now was flowering into something beautiful and meaningful. The auction block that had been meant to destroy them had instead become the foundation of everything they had built. The night that should have ended in tragedy had become the beginning of a story that would touch countless lives. Emma's journal that night recorded not just the events of the day, but her vision for the future. She wrote about the children who would come to them scared and broken, and how they would leave strong and confident. She wrote about the teachers who would dedicate their lives to nurturing young minds, and the families who would open their hearts to children who needed love. Most importantly, she wrote about the power of transformation, about how the worst moments of our lives could become the catalyst for the best things we would ever do. As she closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Emma could hear the sounds of the ranch settling into peaceful quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind rustled through the trees that had stood sentinel over this valley for generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be plans to make, resources to gather, and a dream to turn into reality. But tonight, Emma Morrison fell asleep surrounded by love, protected by strength, and filled with hope for a future that stretched out before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. The little girl who had once stood trembling on an auction block had become a woman who would spend her life making sure no other child would ever face such horror alone. And in that transformation lay the true victory, the kind of triumph that echoed through generations and changed the world one rescued child at a time. 10 years later, Emma Morrison stood before the ornate marble columns of the Colorado State Capitol, her speech notes trembling slightly in her gloved hands. At 31, she had been invited to address the territorial legislature about the Morrison Institute's groundbreaking work with displaced children. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to speak in the same building where laws had once been written that failed to protect children like herself and her sisters. The Institute had grown beyond their wildest dreams. What had started as a simple idea around the dinner table had blossomed into a comprehensive facility that housed, educated, and healed over 200 children at any given time. Emma served as the director while maintaining her teaching duties, and the work had attracted national attention from child welfare advocates and educators across the country. Sarah, now 23 and recently graduated from veterinary college, had returned to help establish the Institute's animal therapy program. Her natural gift with horses and cattle had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how animals could help traumatized children learn to trust again. Lucy had completed her engineering degree and designed the Institute's innovative buildings, creating spaces that felt more like homes than institutions. As Emma waited in the Capitol's marble-floored hallway, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The Morrison Institute wasn't just a school or orphanage. It had become a model for child protection that other territories were beginning to adopt. Representatives from as far away as California and Texas had visited to study their methods and implement similar programs in their own communities. The heavy oak doors to the legislative chamber opened, and a young clerk gestured for Emma to enter. The chamber was larger than she had expected, with rows of polished wooden desks arranged in a semicircle around the speaker's podium. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Emma walked to the podium with measured steps, her dark blue dress rustling softly in the sudden quiet. She had chosen the outfit carefully, wanting to project both professionalism and approachability. Her auburn hair was arranged in a neat chignon, and she wore the simple gold pendant that Morrison had given her on her 21st birthday. "Honorable members of the legislature," Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I come before you today not just as an educator or administrator, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the failures of our current system to protect the most vulnerable among us." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, others skeptical. Many of these men had probably never considered that children could be bought and sold like livestock in their own territory. Emma was here to make sure they understood the reality of what children faced when society failed them. 15 years ago, my sisters and I were nearly sold at auction to pay our guardians' gambling debts. We were children, aged 8, 12, and 16, with no legal protections and no voice in our own fate. We survived that night only because one man chose to intervene, to risk his own safety to protect 3 strangers. A murmur ran through the chamber. Emma had expected this reaction. The story still shocked people who heard it for the first time. What they didn't yet understand was how that terrible night had planted the seeds for something transformative. Jake Morrison saved us, but more than that, he showed us what it meant to be part of a family built on love rather than obligation, protection rather than exploitation. The Morrison Institute exists today because we learned that healing is possible, that children who have been broken can become whole again, and that those who have been rescued have a responsibility to rescue others. Emma went on to describe the Institute's programs in detail. She spoke about the individualized education plans that met each child where they were academically, regardless of their previous schooling. She described the therapeutic workshops where children learned practical skills while processing their trauma through meaningful work. She outlined the family placement program that had successfully matched over 100 children with loving adoptive families. What makes the Morrison Institute unique, Emma continued, is our understanding that healing happens in community. We don't just provide shelter and education, we create families. Every child who comes to us becomes part of something larger than themselves, and they carry that belonging with them for the rest of their lives. She shared statistics that demonstrated the Institute's success. 93% of their graduates went on to stable employment or higher education. Crime rates in their county had dropped significantly as fewer children grew up without supervision or support. Local businesses thrived because the Institute had created a network of skilled, educated young people who chose to remain in the area. But perhaps most importantly, Emma said, her voice growing stronger with passion, we've proven that investing in children isn't just moral imperative, it's economic wisdom. Every child we save becomes a contributing member of society. Every child we educate becomes a leader in their community. Every child we heal breaks the cycle of trauma that can echo through generations. The questions that followed were thoughtful and engaged. Representatives wanted to know about funding models, staffing requirements, and how the Institute's approach could be adapted for different communities. Emma answered each question with the confidence of someone who had lived these challenges and solutions. One elderly representative from the mining district raised his hand. Miss Morrison, what would you say to those who argue that some children are simply beyond help, that society's resources would be better spent on those who haven't already been damaged by their circumstances? Emma felt a flash of anger at the question, but her response was measured and thoughtful. Senator, I would say that every child who walks through our doors proves that theory wrong. We've welcomed children who were convinced they were worthless, who had been told repeatedly that they would never amount to anything. Today, some of those same children are teachers, doctors, engineers, and business owners. The idea that any child is beyond help is not only wrong, it's dangerous. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. More than that, the children who have faced the greatest challenges often become our strongest advocates for others. My sister Sarah, who was 8 years old when she was nearly sold at auction, now runs our animal therapy program and has revolutionized how we help children overcome trauma. The children we save today become the adults who save others tomorrow. After her formal presentation, Emma was approached by several representatives who wanted to discuss bringing similar programs to their districts. A woman from the Eastern Plains, one of only 3 female legislators in the chamber, was particularly interested in the educational components. Miss Morrison, she said, extending her hand. I'm Representative Catherine Wells. I've been following the Institute's work through the newspapers, and I have to say, what you've accomplished is remarkable. Emma shook the woman's hand warmly. Thank you, Representative Wells. I understand you've been advocating for expanded educational opportunities for girls in rural areas. Wells nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and I think our efforts could complement each other beautifully. Many of the children who need the Institute's services are girls who have been overlooked or actively marginalized by traditional educational systems. They talked for nearly an hour about potential collaboration, sharing ideas about how to reach children in remote areas and how to create educational opportunities that prepared young women for roles beyond domestic service. Emma left the meeting energized by the possibilities for expansion and partnership. The train ride back to Millbrook gave Emma time to process the day's events. As the Colorado landscape rolled past the window, she thought about how much the world had changed since that terrible night at the Golden Saloon. Women were beginning to demand political rights. Territories were becoming states with more robust legal protections for children, and attitudes about education and opportunity were slowly shifting. But she also knew that progress was fragile and uneven. For every child they saved at the Institute, there were dozens more who still faced neglect, abuse, and exploitation. The work was far from finished. The Morrison Ranch appeared through the train window as they pulled into the station, and Emma felt the familiar warmth of homecoming. The main house looked much the same as it had 15 years earlier, but the surrounding area had been transformed. The Institute's buildings dotted the landscape like a small town, connected by tree-lined paths and gardens that the children maintained as part of their educational program. Morrison was waiting for her at the station, his hair now completely gray but his posture still straight and strong. At 68, he remained actively involved in the Institute's operations, though he had gradually transferred most administrative responsibilities to Emma and her sisters. "How did it go?" he asked as they walked toward the waiting wagon. Emma smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a job well done. "Better than I hoped. We may have secured funding for 3 new satellite programs, and Representative Wells wants to work with us on educational initiatives for rural girls." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "All 3 of you girls have become exactly the kind of women she hoped you'd be." That evening, the extended Morrison family gathered for their weekly dinner, a tradition that had continued even as the family had grown to include dozens of adopted children, Institute staff, and long-term residents who had chosen to remain part of the community. The dining room had been expanded twice to accommodate the crowd, and the conversations around the table reflected the diversity of backgrounds and experiences that made the Institute special. Emma found herself seated between 2 of their newest arrivals, Maria Elena, a 14-year-old whose parents had died in a mining accident, and Thomas, a 12-year-old who had been living on the streets of Denver before a sympathetic police officer brought him to their attention. Both children were still wary and guarded, but Emma could see the beginnings of trust in their eyes. "Miss Emma," Maria Elena said quietly, "is it true that you used to be scared all the time when you first came here?" Emma considered the question seriously. The children at the Institute knew her story in general terms, but she was always careful about how much detail she shared. "Yes, I was terrified," she said honestly. "I had learned that adults couldn't be trusted, that safety was temporary, and that bad things could happen without warning." Thomas looked up from his plate. "What made you stop being scared?" Emma thought about the many layers of that answer. "I think it was a combination of things. Time helped, because every day that nothing bad happened made it a little easier to believe that maybe I really was safe. But mostly, it was the people around me who showed me through their actions that I was valued and protected." Sarah, now sitting across the table and wearing the practical clothes of someone who had spent the day working with horses, added her own perspective. "For me, it was learning that I had value beyond what had been done to me. Here, I discovered that I was good with animals, that I had something to contribute. When you feel useful and appreciated, it's easier to heal." Lucy nodded from her seat at the far end of the table. "And education was crucial for all of us. Learning gave us options." showed us that we could shape our own futures instead of just surviving whatever happened to us. The conversation continued as the children asked questions about healing, trust, and building new lives after trauma. Emma was struck by how naturally these discussions flowed among people who understood that recovery was a process, not a destination. After dinner, Emma walked through the Institute's grounds, checking on the various buildings and programs that had become her life's work. The workshop building hummed with activity as older children completed their evening projects. The library was filled with students of all ages, some working on lessons and others simply enjoying the pleasure of reading for entertainment. In Mine, the main classroom building, she found Anna Chen leading a discussion group for teenage girls about their future plans and aspirations. Anna had returned to Millbrook 2 years earlier after establishing a successful law practice in Denver, drawn back by the opportunity to create legal protections for the Institute's children and to help other vulnerable young people navigate the complex systems that were supposed to protect them. "How did the legislature respond to your presentation?" Anna asked as the discussion group concluded and the girls headed back to their dormitories. Emma settled into one of the classroom chairs, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the long day. "Better than I expected, honestly. I think we may see some real policy changes in the next few years." Anna nodded thoughtfully. "The timing is good. There's a growing awareness nationally about child welfare issues, and what we've built here is starting to be seen as a model rather than an experiment." They talked about the legal challenges that still face the Institute and its residents. Anna had been working to strengthen the adoption process, making it harder for unscrupulous individuals to exploit vulnerable children. She had also been instrumental in pushing for legislation that would give older children more voice in their own placement decisions. "You know," Anna said as they walked toward the main house, "sometimes I think about what would have happened to all of us if Jake Morrison hadn't walked through those saloon doors that night. Not just you and your sisters, but all the children we've been able to help because of what grew out of that moment." Emma had thought about that counterfactual many times. "I think we would have found other paths to healing and service," she said finally. "Maybe not as directly or as quickly, but I believe that people who have been broken and then healed are drawn to helping others. The specifics might have been different, but the calling would have been the same." Anna smiled, spoken like someone who spent too many years in philosophy discussions with teenage girls. That night, Emma sat in her private study, writing in the journal that had accompanied her through all the major moments of her adult life. She wrote about the day's successes and the challenges that lay ahead. She reflected on the children currently, in their care, and the ones they hoped to reach in the future. But mostly, she wrote about hope. Hope as a deliberate choice, rather than a passive feeling. Hope is something that could be taught and learned and passed from one person to another like a sacred flame. She thought about the 8-year-old girl who had clutched her doll in a saloon cellar, convinced that the world held nothing but cruelty and fear. That little girl could never have imagined that she would grow up to address state legislators, to run an institution that had helped hundreds of children, to be part of a family built on love and commitment rather than blood and obligation. Emma's last entry that night would become something of a motto for the Institute. "We cannot change what has already happened, but we can transform what it means. Every ending can become a beginning. Every wound can become wisdom. And every child who learns to trust again carries the power to change the world." Outside her window, the Institute settled into peaceful quiet. Children slept safely in beds with clean sheets and locked doors that kept danger out rather than trapping innocence in. Teachers and staff members prepared lessons and activities designed to nurture young minds and spirits. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and protective, guardians of a valley where broken things became whole and lost children found their way home. Emma smiled as she closed her journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. The little girl who had once stood trembling on an auction block had become a woman whose life's work ensured that no child would ever face such horror without protection, support, and the absolute certainty that they were valued beyond measure. The story that had begun in darkness and terror had transformed into something luminous and lasting, a testament to the power of love to heal, courage to protect, and hope to transform even the most broken circumstances into opportunities for grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.